good evening, wherever you are. My name is Hassan Salam. I'm the chair of the Egyptian Representative Committee of the Royal College in Egypt. And I would like to welcome you all to this webinar workshop, which is entitled the BJOC Authors and Peer Reviewers webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Egyptian Representative Committee of the College in collaboration with the Egyptian Society for Gynecology and Obstetrics. I want to welcome you and also welcome our very distinguished speakers who have taken out of their time to share with us their vast experience and their knowledge in this particular area. As the Egyptian Representative Committee, we are a committee of 9 people, 5 fellows and 4 members. As you can see them, Professor Qasem Bishri, Abigit Sarhan, Ahmed Zakaria, Hussein Abu al-Makarim, and 4 members, Dr. Wafa Benjamin, who is with us today, Dr. Ahmed Mustafa, Miriam al-Halawani, and Dr. Sameh Salama. We work in collaboration with the RCOG Egypt Liaison Committee, headed these days by Professor Mohammed Al-Fattah, who is a professor of urogynecology in Aberdeen, and which used to be headed by Dr. Sharif Al-Fattah, who is one of our distinguished speakers today. Now, this webinar is organized by the officers of BJOC. BJOC, as you know, is an international journal of obstetrics and gynecology, which was formerly known as the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, changing its name in 2001. It started as the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology of the British Empire. And as you can see, it started in 1902. And this is one of the oldest journals in obstetrics and gynecology. And in fact, it is the first English-speaking journal in obstetrics and gynecology. As you can see, the General Medical Journal started in 1811 by the New England Journal of Medicine, then the Lancet in 1833, British Medical Journal, 1839, then Nature, and then Science. But in journals of obstetrics and gynecology, the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology of the British Empire was only preceded by the German journal Archiv für Gynäkologie, which is of course in German. It is much older than the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Great Journal, and the Greek Journal known as Obstetrics and Gynecology. Now, of course, I published in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and I share the journal. It is our journal. It is the journal of the official journal of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. It also publishes many of the guidelines of the college, as you can see here. And with this, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers, starting with Professor Philip Steer. Professor Philip Steer, who is the emeritus editor of BJOC. He's emeritus professor of obstetrics at Imperial College London, at the Academic Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Chelsea and Westminster Hospitals. And he was going to talk to us about how to structure a view and support tools, conflicts of interest, and confidentiality. We will welcome him. He's going to join us after 15 minutes as he's involved in another activity just now. Dr. Michael March also is the current editor-in-chief of BJOC. He's a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at King's College Hospital, London, my alma mater, and honorary senior lecturer at King's School of Medicine. He's also the UK representative for the FIGO Ethics Committee and past honorary senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, London, across the road from King's. Professor Aristeo Papageorgiou is professor in obstetric and fetal medicine at St. George's Healthcare NHS Trust in London, and at the same time, he's clinical research director of the Oxford Maternal and Perinatal Health Institute at the Nuffield Department of Obstetric Gynecology in beautiful Oxford in England. I don't know how he keeps moving from one place to the other. He is the BJOC Deputy Editor-in-Chief, and today he's going to talk to us about the essential author resources and how to improve your paper. We thank him and welcome him very much. I would like also to welcome Dr. Patrick Chien, who is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief also of BJOC, who is consultant and honorary senior lecturer in obstetrics and gynecology at Ninewells Hospital and Medical School in Dundee, beautiful Scotland, who is going to give us a talk on why should you review for a journal, what to consider before accepting an invitation to review. And I would also like to welcome and thank Dr. Sharif Al-Fattah, who is the person who was behind the organization of all this and other activities. Dr. Shifa Fattah is the scientific editor of BJOC. He's consultant in obstetric and fetal medicine and Southmead Hospital in Bristol, UK, an honorary senior lecturer, University of Bristol. And as I said, he's the former chair of the Liaison Committee, Egypt UK Liaison Committee, and also the former RCOG MTI scheme lead. He's going to talk to us about value added, the value in our paper for publication. And from Cairo, I would like to welcome Professor Mohammed Mumtaz. Professor Mumtaz, we all know him. He's the past chair of obstetric gynecology in Cairo University and the vice president of the Egyptian Society for Gynecology and Obstetrics. He's also our representative in FIGO, and he's going to moderate the first part of this session with Professor Rasha Kamel. And also, I would like to welcome and thank Professor Amr Nouri, my predecessor. As you all know, he started all these activities. He's a professor in obstetric and gynecology at Cairo University at the National Laser Institute. He's a former chair of the committee, as I say, and he's also a board member and honorary treasurer of the Egyptian Society of Obstetric and Gynecology. And he's going to moderate the second part with Dr. Wafa Benjamin. And from Cairo also, I want to welcome and thank Professor Rasha Kamel, who is professor in obstetric gynecology again at Cairo University. She's a senior consultant at the maternal fetal medicine unit in Qasr Al Aini Hospital of Cairo University. And she's also an ambassador of the International Society of Ultrasound in Obstetric Gynecology in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa region, who is going to moderate the first part of the webinar with Professor Mumtaz. And from Cairo, Dr. Wafa Benjamin, who is a consultant in obstetric gynecology at the General Organization for Teaching Hospitals and Institutes. She's a member of the advisory board of the Egyptian Fellowship Program in Obstetric Gynecology, member, and more importantly, the treasurer of our committee, the International Committee for the Royal College in Egypt. And with this, I want to thank them again and welcome them tonight. And please, for the audience, could you please put your questions in the question answer section, not in the chat section, if possible. And if you like, you may like to add your name and where you come from, because I understand that we have at least 1,300 registrations from some 50 countries. And finally, and not importantly, very importantly, I would like to thank Merck Pharmaceuticals for supporting this activity and other activities. And with this, I cede my microphone and video to Professor Mohammed Mumtaz and Professor Rasha Kamel to moderate the first part of this webinar. Professor Mumtaz.
Thank you, Professor Salam. It gives me a great pleasure to be here. It's my second time to be part of the moderators of the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Egyptian Liaison Committee and the Egyptian Society of Gynecology and Obstetrics. And of course, the topic or the theme of today, which is research, I think it's very, very important nowadays with a lot of debate and discussions about integrity of research, about how to be able to succeed. And of course, the word publish or die is still valid in many countries, and it's starting to be also in many universities in Egypt. If you want to be promoted to assistant professor or professor, you should publish in international journals. And now it's becoming more and more difficult. So I think we are all interested in learning what are the steps and what are the needs for this kind of work. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Marsh. He will give us a presentation about publication ethics. He is the British Journal of Gynecology editor-in-chief. He is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist and honorary senior lecturer at King's College Hospital, London. He is the UK representative for the FIGO Ethics Committee. He is past honorary senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, London, UK. He will not be able to join us live, so I think the presentation will be recorded. And at the end, if you have any questions, please do put them in the question section. And I think Dr. Shen will be able to reply these questions and answer them. So please, can you start the presentation?
Thank you very much for asking the BJOC team to be involved in this meeting. And I'm going to start things off firstly with the very important topic of publication ethics. By the end of this talk, I hope you'll be able to list the types of scientific misconduct and questionable practice, explain what each type involves, explain the repercussions if these are identified, and explain, most importantly, how they can be. Now, one can divide publication ethics into two categories, the most serious being scientific misconduct and the less serious, perhaps questionable practice. So within scientific misconduct, this includes undeclared conflicts of interest, ghost or guest authorship, plagiarism, duplicate publication, data fabrication, or the absence of informed consent or ethics approval. And questionable practice, a less egregious deviation from publication ethics, includes salami publication, data falsification, and misuse of the registration process. Scientific misconduct can be defined as serious deviation from accepted practices of the relevant research community, committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly, and proven, most importantly, by a preponderance of evidence. And of course, these sort of cases do get a lot of media attention when they occur. How common are scientific misconduct and questionable practice? Well, there are various ways of looking at this. One can look at the number of retracted articles, although these usually represent a small proportion of the cases where there may be ethical misdeeds. And one can see certainly that the number of retracted articles has increased steadily over the last 20 years or so, and they include as causes fraud, suspected fraud, error, plagiarism, and duplicate publication. One can also look at expressions of concern, and these are things that are published by journals saying that there are some concerns about the validity of a paper, of a data set, and these are under investigation. And about 25% of these lead to eventual retraction. And one can see that the number of expressions of concern have gone up certainly over the last decade or so. We recently published a paper looking solely at retractions in obstetrics and gynecology, and you can see that this has been steadily increasing. This is a study from 85 right to 2018. And the median time of publication to retraction is about 2 years, so there's often a delay in retracting such papers. Group also looked in detail at the types of papers. It looked like gynecological oncology papers were rather overrepresented, although that may be because the authors were mainly gynae-oncologists. But you can see obstetrics and gynecology also make up quite large proportions of those papers that were retracted. No particular study design is exempt from the possibility of retraction. So randomized controlled trials, prospective studies, retrospective studies, all represent. And these are the reasons for retraction. And you can see, as in the previous slide, plagiarism, errors in the data, and fabrication and falsified data are quite well represented. What's very unfortunate is no reason was provided in some 17% of cases. And of course, there's an enormous difference between an error in the data and data fabrication. So it is unfortunate that, that some journals don't make it clear why a paper may be retracted. Looking at the numbers of authors involved in retracted, and these are the first authors or the senior authors, you can see for the majority of papers that only one paper is retracted by one particular journal relating to one particular author. So in other words, the majority of cases over this long time period, one author made, shall we say, one error on one occasion. And there are only a small number of authors where several papers, in this case 9, 10, 3 papers have been retracted. probably because of a consistent problem with that particular author. But it is likely that all of these figures are underrepresentations of what actually goes on. And perhaps a better way of approaching this is to look at those papers that have specifically asked scientists, this is not just in medicine but in science generally, whether they themselves have been involved in any data falsification or fabrication, whether they know of colleagues who've done this, or whether they've heard of this in general. And this is an interesting meta-analysis done by Finale in 2009. And they ended up looking at 18 papers looking at these aspects of fabrication. And they looked at self-reported data fabrication, falsification, alteration. And these were obviously anonymous questionnaires that were given out in the majority of these papers, and I think in all of the 18 studies used in this final analysis. And you can see that about 2% of people admitted to themselves to self-reporting data fabrication, falsification, and alteration. When asked about whether they knew this was in colleagues, then the figure was in the order of 15% or so. So much higher than those that self-admitted it. So the true figure probably lies between. If we look at questionable research practices, then approximately 5% of people admitted that in these studies admitted that they'd been involved in that themselves. The figure was nearly 20% for those for colleagues, and known cases of fraud or bias in general, across the specialty, then about 45%. So the figure in actuality for questionable research practices in the general scientific community probably ranges somewhere between 5 and 20%. What are the consequences of these misdemeanors in publication ethics? Well, for scientific misconduct, there is an investigation and notification of all the involved parties, and the repercussions may include any or all of the following. So a warning to the author, informing the author's institution or their research governance team. They may be banned in publishing for that specific journal for 3 years or longer. The editor of other journals may be informed about the perpetrating act. An erratum is certainly published, and a full retraction of the article is undertaken either online and by online or hardcover. And a GMC or state regulatory board may be involved. So it has very serious implications for the individual clinicians. For questionable practices, there's an internal journal investigation and discussion, and usually the journal will reject your paper, and in some cases the relevant institution may be informed. So I'm not going to tell you how to avoid data fabrication, but I am going to go through some of the other problems with publication ethics and give you some ideas as to how they may be avoided. So that's undeclared conflict of interest, guest authorship, plagiarism, duplicate publication, and in questionable practice, salami publication and data falsification. I'm going to go through each of these in turn and give you some ideas that I hope will lead you to avoid problems. So with disclosure and conflict of interest, the most important thing is tell everything that is required and expected, including disclosures of funding. If there's any doubt, really disclose it. It is, obviously studies are sponsored by industry, and there may be some conflicts of interest, but disclosing those is fine, and leave it up to the reader and the editors and those that are reviewing the paper to decide whether there is a significant conflict of interest. The problem is not declaring these things. So anything that may impact on your work, personal relationships, finance arrangements, employment by industry, any of those sort of things, declare them, and then leave it to the reader, whether that be a scientific editor or referee, to decide whether that's a conflict of interest. Authorship criteria are really quite strictly defined now by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and each author needs to have made a substantial contribution to the conception and design, and drafting the article and revise it, and final approval of the version to be published, and each of the authors agrees to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So to qualify for an author, each of these must be fulfilled. So in other words, each author needs to have made a substantial and intellectual contribution to the study. Including authors only because of their reputation, authority, or friendship is a clear violation of publication ethics. And technical services, translating text, recruiting patients, etc., providing funding, logistic, administrative support are usually not sufficient criteria for authorship alone. And this is where the acknowledgement section of a paper should be used, and these papers included there, these people will be included there. And for many journals now, the specific individual contribution of each of the authors must be specified when submitting the paper for publication. Plagiarism, double publication, is the copying of ideas, data, or words without attribution. And it's the textual copying, basically, of another person's work. It's obviously very important that there isn't plagiarism double publication because, for instance, in meta-analysis, such papers may be included on more than one occasion and skew the data. And about 10–20% of allegations of serious misconduct involve plagiarism. So how does one avoid plagiarism? Well, always acknowledge the contributions of others to your work. Enclose text from other sources if it's verbatim in quotation marks. If you're summarizing other people's works, use your own words. And when paraphrasing others' work, use your own words. And of course, identify the source of information. There's also the issue of avoiding copyright. And most would say that a block of text of 200 words, if copied from one to the other, would involve a breach of copyright. So one also needs to be familiar with the copyright laws if one wants to avoid copyright. So if you're paraphrasing, summarizing other people's works, you must reproduce the exact meaning of the other person's ideas, of course, if you're attributing them, but use your own words and sentences and structure. And if you're in doubt whether you're using a phrase or a concept that is common knowledge in inverted commas, then provide a citation. And as I mentioned, be aware of infringing copyright, which is a separate issue to plagiarism, duplicate publication. Now, salami publication is the inappropriate division of study outcomes into several articles. Now, sure, there may be large studies where several papers are necessary to tease out the different aspects of a study, but where this is done unnecessarily, this is salami publication. This unnecessary compartmentalization provides only minor increases in the understanding, it's unnecessary. One of the ways of avoiding in a sense your paper being rejected because of this is to, if there are accompanying papers on the same data set but with different study outcomes, then include those in the information with the letter. So enclose other papers if there's a paper submitted from a larger data set, and make it very clear the nature of the previous dissemination. And most journals now, certainly before papers are being published, use plagiarism checkers so they can identify whether there's duplication. And of course, it is possible for you to use a plagiarism checker yourself and just make sure that you've not inadvertently copied too much text from either your own or other papers. Data falsification is in contrast to fabrication, where obviously you're inventing data. And falsification of the data is using statistical lightness of hand to draw conclusions from your paper that the data don't necessarily merit. So so-called data mining, P mining, using the wrong statistical test and selectively publishing the data. Now, people make mistakes with their statistics, and one of the unfortunate things is carelessness or statistical naivety may mimic falsification. One doesn't know whether this was an intentional problem or not. So it is very important that you get your stats right, and involving somebody who has experience in statistics, or even getting a statistician involved, and they're very expensive, but certainly somebody who can check the statistics within the team is very important, and will avoid this problem with potential somebody being criticized for falsification of the statistical methods. Currently, this isn't considered misconduct, but rather questionable practice. So if this is found in a paper, it is likely to lead to the paper being rejected, at least. So what do editors and reviewers like or don't like? Well, when they're looking at papers in terms of ethics, they don't like duplicate publication, guest authorship, ghost authorship, undeclared conflicts of interest, fabrication of data, and falsification of data, and studies without ethics approval. So my key messages from this would, and the mistakes that are made perhaps most often would be, for conflict of interest, if in doubt, declare it. If you're uncertain whether this constitutes a conflict of interest, then declare it, and it may or may not be eliminated from the final draft of the paper. Let the journal decide, let the editors and the referees decide whether this is significant or not. But the problem is where you don't declare a conflict of interest and this is subsequently found. Make sure that all your authors are entitled to be there, and that you can't be accused of guest authorship or ghost authorship. Get your statistics right, so that you can't be criticized for statistical lightness of hand. And if you have, if you can, use a plagiarism guideline and use a checker. And thank you very much indeed. I hope you found this helpful.
Thank you very much. I just like to remind you that this was a recorded presentation, and that Dr. Shen will be replying to the questions for this talk. I think we have one question. If you could kindly send their email, sorry.
So I can see a question in the chat.
Okay, is removal of statistics outliers, I think, considered falsification, and to what extent?
So among statisticians, when dealing with outliers, there is some situation where you can remove an outlier. If you're going to do that, you need to report it very clearly in your method section and your result section. And you also need to analyze the data with and without the outlier to see whether there's any. So in other words, you need to do a sensitivity analysis to see whether there's any difference in your conclusion with or without the outlier being included or excluded in it. But the important thing that is you need to report what you've done very explicitly so that the readership can make that judgment. And obviously at the submission stage, it will be likely to be subjected to a statistical reviewer as well. So the reviewer will also be able to advise you as to whether it is reasonable to remove that outlier or not.
Can I just add, again, statistical outliers removal probably is more acceptable with the larger numbers. But if you have a limited number and then you decide to remove the outlier, then this will be a large percentage and it will have a large impact on the actual results and conclusions.
I completely agree with Sharif. And if I could add also, ideally, you would declare how you're going to deal with outliers before you do the analysis. So within your protocol, you should have a way that you say, this is how we're going to deal with outliers, this is how we're going to define them, and this is how we're going to deal with them. That is not always possible in observational studies where you don't know what you're going to find beforehand. But as much as possible, declaring what you're going to do, because otherwise your treatment of outliers may well be influenced by what you see. The second point is that outliers should really truly be outliers. So, often defined as, 5 standard deviations away from the expected mean in many papers. But there are papers, for example, well-respected papers, where, for instance, in fetal growth curves, where authors have excluded fetuses that were above or below the 5th or 95th centile. And these are, often older studies, but you can imagine that if you do that, you're excluding a very large proportion of your data that can really not be considered as true outliers. So yes, define your outliers properly and as much as possible in advance of your analysis. Your analysis plan should be in advance of undertaking the analysis.
There is another question. Is quoting national guidelines word for word
in terms of clinical recommendations considered plagiarism?
So I'm just trying to figure out the question itself. So it says, can you publish the same data in a journal with a different, oh no, that's a different question.
No, it's in the question and answer.
So the question is I think, is whether you can quote word for word from national guidelines with a recommendation. I think when it comes to guideline recommendations, obviously language is important. If you get the wording wrong, it can sometimes result in a completely different meaning. The important thing is that you need to, if you're going to not quote it exactly, you need to keep the words, you need to keep the meaning of the recommendation as precise as possible. If you're going to quote it word for word, then you need to reference it to the guideline. You need to make it very sure this is actually verbatim quoted from the guideline itself. I don't see the situation where it is common that you need to quote the recommendation word for word. There's always ways of describing the recommendation in a slightly different word, with certain different words itself. I don't know what's Sharif and Ari's views on this.
Yes, the question is about quoting the national guidelines for clinical recommendations, and I'm not sure what is meant by clinical recommendations. We're talking about publishing research. So if you're writing your local guidelines for your hospital, then that's fine, of course, to use the national guidelines. But if you're producing research and quoting the national guidelines as part of your recommendation, then obviously this will be just a quotation, but this will not be the main outcome of your study. Your main outcome of your study will be what you're actually studied and your findings.
Absolutely right. And in general, you can copy word for word small segments of text as long as it's properly cited. So for example, in your introduction, you might say that the NICE guidelines in the UK recommends that you should screen for preeclampsia using clinical risk factors. And you might actually copy, that sentence or a couple of sentences from the NICE guidelines saying exactly how it's being done, how it's recommended. All you need to do is make sure you give the citation where those words are coming from. What you cannot do is copy large chunks of text and not allocate it properly to the source document.
There is another interesting question, actually. I think it can be broadened a little bit. The question says, as a corresponding author, what actions have to do, or should I have to do if I feel my published work has been
plagiarized by somebody else and published in another journal. I think this would be broadened a little bit. It's not only plagiarized, or even my data was copied, or I mean, some sort of that. I feel that there is somebody who has stolen my work and published in another journal, or what should I do?
So the majority of the medical journals are members of the Committee on Publication Ethics. And I have a couple of slides in my talk, actually. They give very clear flowcharts as how to deal with different scenarios. And there is, for instance, a flowchart of what to do when you suspect plagiarism. So if you read a paper that you think is clearly your own work plagiarized by someone else, the thing to do would be to address a letter to the editor-in-chief of that journal and make the editor-in-chief aware of that fact, because in all likelihood that they will not know, otherwise they wouldn't have published that work in the first place. And if that happens, and if the journal is reputable, as the BJOC would be, then that kicks into place a process which is followed, which starts with a flowchart, suspected plagiarism, and it goes down the flowchart. So there will be some review to look if this truly seems plagiarized, and if it is, then the author is contacted for explanation. And as Mike says, that can escalate to contacting the institution of the author, or in extreme cases, if there's scientific misconduct, even the regulatory body, which in the UK would be the General Medical Council. So scientific misconduct, which plagiarism is part of, is a very, very serious issue. And if you suspect it, you can make the editor-in-chief aware. Now, that may not be easy if you're a junior researcher and the person who's plagiarized your work is some famous professor, but you could potentially even write to an editor anonymously, I think, in such a circumstance.
The last question: if you are invited as a co-author in a publication that you did not participate in originally, but you feel your input will be valuable, is your acceptance considered unethical?
I think it depends on what you feel that your input is acceptable. I mean, if you haven't actually provided any significant input into the study design or the data analysis or data collection and writing the report, as Mike has indicated in his presentation, then I don't think you justify your invitation to be invited, in which case my advice is that you should decline that invitation politely.
Thank you very much. I think we should move to the next talk. I'd like to invite Professor Rasha Kamel, who is my colleague and a dear friend. Please, Professor Kamel, can you introduce our next speaker and talk?
Our next talk is titled Essential Author Resources, How to Improve Your Paper. It's going to be presented by Professor Aris Papageorgiou. Professor Aris Papageorgiou is the BJOC Deputy Editor-in-Chief. He's a professor in obstetrics and fetal medicine, St. George's Healthcare National Health Trust in London, and Clinical Research Director of the Oxford Maternal and Perinatal Health Institute, Nutfield Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Oxford, England, UK. Please, Aris.
Thank you so much, Rasha, and I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my slides. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'll be talking today about some of the essential resources. I know it can be difficult sometimes to keep up with everything, so please feel free to contact me personally. This is my email here, or you can also contact me on Twitter. We talked a little bit about declarations of interest. So these are my declarations of interest today giving this talk. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief of BJOC, and I do receive an honorarium from BJOC for being the Deputy Editor-in-Chief. It's not big, but it is there. And you can see the rest of my declarations on there. I don't consider that any of these would adversely impact my presentation today to you. The idea really was for me to try and run through how you can turn your paper into a product that is most likely to be published. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to understand how we handle papers, and also for you to be aware of how to best prepare and how to best present your paper. Now, through my presentation, you'll see some of these little QR codes. And if you use your iPhone or whatever phone you have, you will be able to see the website that belongs to. So in terms of the editorial process, when you submit a paper on our Allen Track website, the first thing that happens is that that paper goes to the editorial office, and the editorial office will do an initial quality check by the editorial assistant. So they will check that it's actually meeting the guidelines of BJOC, and you'd be surprised how many papers are submitted which have nothing to do with the way that the paper should be presented for BJOC. And the papers are then allocated to one of 3 deputy editors-in-chief. We receive over 2,000 submissions per year, and between 3 deputy editors-in-chief, we will see all those papers. So think about the numbers and think why it is important for your paper to be already in a good quality in terms of being in the correct format, being without spelling errors or grammatical errors, or conforming to some of the guidelines that I'll be showing you, because it is very easy to press the reject button if the paper is really not even in a state to be properly assessed. So from those 2,000 papers that are originally allocated to the deputy editors-in-chief, about half the papers will be rejected out of hand by either the editor-in-chief or one of the 3 deputy editors-in-chief. And you know, we're not tough, but we do have to make difficult decisions in terms of priority of papers, so you need to be aware of that. So if it's not rejected, it is then allocated to a scientific editor. And the reasons that we reject papers and don't give them to scientific editors is, as I say, when people just don't adhere to the instructions for authors, if the paper is really the wrong style layout, if it's missing essential sections, for example, there's no disclosure on ethics or such like. Issues around trial registration I will cover separately, but those are really, really important. If the language is very poor, so poor sometimes that it's difficult to catch the meaning of what the authors are trying to convey. And we're very sensitive to the fact that, it's not, English isn't everyone's first language, and we will be very willing to support improvements in English language, including with the Wiley language editors. But if you can't understand what you're trying to, the meaning of the paper in the first place, is obviously difficult to progress. If the paper is really outside the scope of BJOC, so for example, it's a subspecialty issue within a subspecialty that is really only relevant to a very small number of clinicians. Remember, the BJOC is a journal that is really intended for obstetricians and gynecologists that have papers of broad interest. And then, of course, issues around ethics and others. If the paper is then allocated to a scientific editor, the scientific editor reads the paper in much more detail than the deputy editor-in-chief, and the scientific editor may conclude that, for instance, the methods have fundamentally flawed, or the conclusions cannot be based on the results of the paper, and the scientific editor may feel that this paper really does not deserve even peer review because of the low quality. If that is the case, the scientific editor will open a consultation with other editors, the editor-in-chief and deputy editors-in-chief, and may reject without further review. It's a tough decision sometimes, but also I would say that if the paper has very low chances of ever being accepted, as an author, it's preferable for you to have a quick rejection without review than to have the paper reviewed for a very long time. Sometimes referees can take some time to turn papers around for it to be ultimately rejected on editorial grounds. So we try as much as possible to make decisions around editorial priorities quickly so that you can carry on and submit your paper elsewhere. If it gets through that filtering process, it's then sent to reviewers. And of course, the reviewers may agree that the paper should be rejected, and the paper is rejected, or the reviewers may be split or suggest acceptance, and then the paper is again consulted on by a number of deputy editors and editors. And this is a very robust process, so you get a very, if the paper is good, you get a very good chance of it being accepted. If the referees are split, for instance, there's a lot of wisdom within these consultations by the editors, and they often contribute, and they may well rescue a paper where one of the referees has raised some concerns. Very recently, a referee highlighted an important paper that was missing from a systematic review, and actually that paper was not relevant to that systematic review, but that was picked up by the editors. The contrary is also true. Sometimes the referees may oversee or overlook, rather, an important limitation that the editors pick up. After either reject or accept a decision, but most commonly the decision at this stage will be revisions, which after these are made by the authors, the editor will go through, sometimes with a re-review, but more often than not without. Editors recommend rejection if the paper is clearly outside the scope of BJOC or too subspecialist. Rare conditions. Now, authors love rare conditions. They write a case report of the, one case they've ever seen or they will ever see in their life. But actually, most readers don't like very rare conditions, and most editors don't like very rare conditions because you're just simply unlikely to ever encounter such a rare condition in your career. If the paper is really local, very much of local interest rather than of international or national interest, that is also a problem. If the statistical design is very poor, if the numbers included are very, very small, and often also if the conclusions are just not justified by the study. So the study shows one thing and the authors conclude something else. That is too also a problem. Already Mike outlined these major red flags of duplicate publication, guest and ghost authorship, of course, fabrication and falsification, which are absolutely must not occur. There have been, unfortunately, cases, including in BJOC, where there's strong evidence of data fabrication or data falsification that leads to retraction. You may feel that it may help your career in the short term to have a paper in BJOC or in another journal, but ultimately this is something that can actually undermine and honestly ruin careers of researchers and those co-authors too, by extension. So please be really careful. Someone asked about what happens if I'm invited to be a co-author. By all means, if you're contributing to the paper, agree to be a co-author, but please make sure that you know that the data you are agreeing to be a co-author on are robust. Because if they are found out subsequently that they're not, that can be really bad for you. These are more common things that we don't like. Fortunately, falsification and fabrication are rare, but these are things that we don't like. Lots and lots of acronyms peppered throughout the paper, repetition of the same concept or the same result without a purpose, overinterpretation of the data, especially in trials of small numbers. Claims to originality. We are the first people ever to have shown this in this uniquely world-beating first study. Very little in science is completely original. If you look hard enough, you are likely to find someone has thought of your idea previously. We don't like audits generally. We don't like guidelines in general. Opinions often strong on, people are often strong on opinion and low on fact. That is not liked. And case reports are generally rejected. We do very occasionally publish a case report. It really must be something highly novel or of very broad interest, something brand new. For instance, there were 1 or 2 case reports early on in the coronavirus pandemic where there were really just no data. But in general terms, case reports will be rejected straight out of hand. The other thing that editors don't like is ignoring their suggestions. So if you get a response from an editor saying, we would like to accept your paper, but you need to change 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, please do it. Or if you're not going to do it, you really have to defend your position. very well. We also, of course, take into account the strength of the evidence. So if you think about the evidence pyramid, what we like to see are systematic reviews with meta-analysis. And I've put in red there of high quality trial data. There are lots of systematic reviews of low quality studies. They are not very useful. So, you know, don't be surprised. And systematic reviews, I do many of them. Systematic reviews are very, very hard work. You know, some people who don't do them think that they're easy papers to write. They're really not. So if you're going to embark on doing a systematic review, make sure that they're going to be of high quality data, because the systematic review is only as strong as the data that are included within it. And by that, I mean trials of properly powered and conducted randomized trials, which is the second sort of level of the evidence pyramid. Well-designed controlled trials, even if they're without randomization, can be acceptable, as can comparative cohort trials. Case control studies have high risks of bias. So if you are going to do a case control study, please beware of how you're going to control for risk of confounding within your study. Case series are lower down the pyramid, and especially if they are, you know, sort of trying to replicate what a trial does without being randomized. And opinions and case reports are at the bottom of that pyramid. So toolkits then, how can we improve our papers? So if you go to the website, you will find a whole toolkit for writing research. There's a whole bunch of resources that will set you on the right road to writing a great research paper. But please don't collect all your data, do the study, and then remember to go to these reporting guidelines. Look at the reporting guidelines right at the outset when you're designing your study. They can be extremely helpful in helping you think through how your study should be conducted. And I know that a number of people will come back to the Equator Library and also the ICMJE recommendations. So this is a link to ICJME, the International Collaboration of Medical Journal Editors. So this is a sort of general structure of the paper: abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion. And remember that the discussion must be structured as well. And you can see the other things that are listed there. The abstract is really crucial. So it's estimated that something like 80% of your citations of your paper, people will only ever look at the abstract. The person who will be citing, these are researchers who are citing your paper. Even the researchers who cite your paper will only have read the abstract in a large proportion of cases. So having a good abstract is absolutely key. Try and draw in the reader, make sure you have numerical results with your confidence intervals and your p-values inside the abstract, so that anyone who wants to cite your paper can fish them out from the abstract. I'm not saying that that's a good thing that people are not reading full papers, but it's the reality. Abstracts need to be written with great care. They're often kind of an afterthought. Often the paper is written and then, you know, the most junior author is tasked with quickly pulling together an abstract. That's the wrong way around. Make sure your abstract is structured, and this is the way that structured abstracts are published in BJOC with these subheadings. So think about your abstract as being a standalone mini paper, so that if someone were to read it, they could get the main message. And of course, within the abstract, you must avoid abbreviations. Into the introduction, try and tell a story, provide a context or the background for the study. What's the problem? What do we know? What's the question? And how are we going to answer it? This is not a place for undertaking a systematic review of the whole literature. And this is also not a place for you to show off everything you know about the subject. It needs to be brief, it needs to be focused, and it needs to state the very specific purpose of what you want to achieve. What is known? What is your question? What is your hypothesis? Why do you want to do this study? And then state the objective. We did the study in order to X, Y, and Z. In the methods, the guiding principle is to explain to other researchers how you did the study and why you did the study in a particular way, so that if they were to replicate the study, they would have enough information in the methods to go away and do the same study elsewhere. And with access to the data, they would be able to reproduce your results. So the statistical plan and the statistical analysis part of the paper needs to be very, very clear. Please report your primary and secondary outcomes very clearly. Our primary outcome in this paper is this. Our secondary outcomes are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and also how these will be ascertained or measured. Many papers fall down on the fact that it's just completely unclear what the primary outcome, what the main outcome of the study is meant to be. Also in the methods, remember that you only can really include the information that you had when you started the study, when you were writing the protocol. Any information that you obtained during the study, think about it that way, belongs in the results. So you could write your methods of your paper before you even start the study. This is how we're going to do it. And then the results are, this is what we found. Details of statistical analysis I've already outlined, and please ensure that you have a statement of approval from your ethics committee. In terms of the results should be in a logical sequence and really should follow the methods. So if in the methods you say, we're going to do experiment 1, 2, 3, and 4, then the results should mirror exactly the same sequence. Otherwise, if you're jumping forward and backward, it's very confusing. Please don't repeat all the data in the text and then again in the tables and then again in the figures. Choose one method, how your data are best shown, and ensure that all the primary and secondary outcomes that you've talked about in the methods are also in the results. Numerical results need to be given, so don't just give percentages, you need to give the numbers. 80% is not good enough. You need to say exactly what the number of patients included were. Specify your statistical significance. Try and use graphs as much as possible as alternative to tables, and don't just report p-values. It's much more important and much more appropriate to include effect sizes such as likelihood ratios or relative risks or odds ratios with a 95% confidence intervals. Finally, just a note, sometimes we use in language things like random or normal or significant. These have very specific statistical meanings, so try and avoid non-technical uses of such technical terms. The discussion and the conclusion really needs to be structured and outline the main findings of the study, the strengths of the study and its limitations, and how to interpret the study in light of other evidence. So what are the implications for clinical practice and the implications for research? I won't dwell on conflicts of interest, which I think we have already talked about. I just wanted to give a short outline of the importance of using trial registration and reporting guidelines, and then I'll show you why we need good reporting guidelines. There was a study from the BMJ, and this is interpretation bias. So these were proper trials, properly done, properly registered. 17 of them were negative, okay, published in the BMJ. And 4 of the 17 negative studies, in the what the study adds box, the author said you should use this treatment, although the study was negative. This is what we call interpretation bias. In other words, the study was negative, but the authors interpreted the results differently from what they actually showed. And this is a BMJ, this is not a small journal. The other important fact already alluded to by Mike is how we can avoid misdemeanors. And I wrote about this in a recent editorial last year, in fact, on ensuring good science. It's available if you want to read it on also on a podcast. And Mike mentioned this paper by Chambers, who looked at 176 retracted articles just in our field in obstetrics and gynecology. The commonest cause was plagiarism and data falsification. And what worried me most about this paper was that 3/4 of the retractions had happened in the last 10 years. This is really harmful because, you know, you might consider that a minor misdemeanor just affects your paper, but your paper may come into systematic reviews, go into meta-analyses, and could alter the conclusions of meta-analysis, be adopted into international guidelines, and cause harm to women or children. And a number of papers, because of this, are retracted, including, unfortunately, in our journal. So how can we prevent this from happening? Well, apart from a meticulous account, one of the important things is to follow reporting guidelines. So these are statements, and they give you advice on how to report your study, and they're usually in the form of a checklist. Okay, they don't replace the instructions to authors, but they should help you to structure your paper properly. And if you go to the BJOC website, if you go to author guidelines, you will find them there. And one of the most important ones, which I'll talk about now briefly, is the Equator Network. The Equator Network, and here is a link to the Equator Network, has assembled in one place all the reporting guidelines for the main types of study that you might want to undertake. And these include all these different types. Now, you might not know exactly what study you're doing, so you can even click here and say, I'm not sure which reporting guideline to use. So you can click on that, and it'll talk you through your different types of studies that you might be doing, and will explain to you what your type of study is and which particular guideline you should use, whether it's STARD or CONSORT or PRISMA, etc. So going back to that, then once you've decided on the type of study that you're going to do, and as I said before, please use this at the beginning of the study, not at the end. You then can click on these toolkits here, and it will help you on how to write your research, how to undertake peer review, and other things are there too. So these are some of the common guidelines. I won't go through all of them, but you will recognize some of the names from studies that you have read, I am sure. Some of the most important ones that we adhere to in our journal are STROBE for observational studies in epidemiology, STARD, which is diagnostic accuracy studies, and PRISMA, which are important for systematic reviews and analysis, and of course the CONSORT statement. The CONSORT statement is the minimum set of recommendations for reporting randomized trials. And please, these are the minimum standards. So you can report more, but at the very least, this is what you need to report. And the idea of this is to make absolutely sure that readers can understand the design of the trial, how it was conducted, how it was analyzed, how it should be interpreted. And this is a sort of checklist that you get. It's a cookbook. So if you follow the whole checklist and you get to the end of the checklist, you've written your paper. And as I said, and I will repeat again, please make sure you look at this right at the beginning. So if you're going to submit a trial to BJOC, you must submit a CONSORT flowchart. You must also provide a copy of your ethics approval, and you must also provide a copy of the original protocol upon which the trial was based. And most important of all, you need to have proof of registration. And that proof of registration of your study has to be prospective. Why is registration so important? Registration of a trial is absolutely crucial because it says, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to analyze the data. These are our primary outcomes. These are our secondary outcomes. And it's absolutely key to ensure scientific, ethical, and morally that the trials are properly done. And the WHO requests trial registration, and almost all journals now will request that your trial is registered, and it must be registered prospectively. Retrospective registration is not acceptable. It is also not acceptable to say, I started my trial in January and I registered my study in March, but it was still during the study period. No, your trial must be registered before the first patient is recruited, and preferably before at the time of ethical approval. There are a number of clinical trial registries. You don't have to use the WHO trial registry, and this is a list of them just here. Ethics approval, of course, is also required, and it needs to come from a formally constituted review board. There are very few places now that don't have review boards, and the Declaration of Helsinki must also be adhered to. Sometimes we get a paper that says no ethics approval was required. If your study is judged exempt from review, you need a letter from the committee saying the committee has looked at this study and they have concluded that it is exempt from review. Just you saying so is not appropriate. Of course, this is dependent on having human participants. So systematic reviews, for instance, would not require that. But if there's human or indeed animal participants, you need to have a letter from your committee saying it's been approved or it's been exempted. We've talked already about plagiarism, altering data, but also please, there have been instances where people have manipulated photographs, Western blots, Southern blots, manipulated. They are not illustrations if they are based on scientific importance. I won't cover plagiarism because we've done that already, but just to make you aware that all papers that are submitted before acceptance go through this system called Authenticate, which looks for any large chunks of words that have been copied from other existing papers. Just one last word on the Committee on Publication Ethics. The COPE is an independent body, and the journal is a member of COPE, as are most medical journals. And what COPE does, it does this: it promotes integrity in scholarly research and its publication. It's a fantastic website with lots and lots of good resources, and we use it as editors sometimes when we have a problem like this and someone asks a question about plagiarism. This is one on fabricated data. The reviewer, or perhaps a reader, may express a suspicion of fabricated data, and there's a flow chart there that tells you exactly what you need to do, what to do when the author responds or the author doesn't respond, how to, when, at what point to contact an institution or even a regulatory body. So all these things are quite clear and we follow that. So I hope I haven't scared you off with all the regulations and all the resources, but given you an insight as to how to improve the chances of your paper being accepted, and hopefully come to this stage where you can then create wonderful ways of promoting your paper. And again, this is a little link to how to best promote your paper. So I'll close here with this summary slide. Please let me have any questions and I'm happy to open the discussion. And I'm sorry I went over.
It's all right. Very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Professor Giorgio, for the comprehensive talk. I have one question here. There has been some questions and they have been promptly answered by the speakers on the chat box. Thank you very much. There's one question here. Are there journals that review the articles anonymously? And do you think that this is better?
The peer review was a question on the peer review.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are there journals that do it anonymously, and do you think that this is better?
So this is a long and ongoing debate, and I think we have a peer review talk within the within our thing today. I think Phil is talking about
yes.
that. There are broadly two categories. You can either review anonymously, or you can reveal the names of the referees. And there's even been some studies to see if randomized studies to see if one or the other method is superior, and it doesn't seem to be particularly that one method is better than the other. Of course, anonymous review makes it more likely that a referee is able to speak more plainly about the deficiencies of a paper, maybe more honest, especially if the referee may be a very knowledgeable but perhaps more junior referee, and the author may be a big important professor. The junior referee may not want to cut swords with. On the other hand, some of our referees often sign their own reviews, even though they are anonymous. They wish to be declared. And some journals have open peer review, which of course is perfectly acceptable too. I don't know, Patrick, if you feel that one method or the other is superior. In my experience, neither is.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's been several studies now looking at the quality of peer review, whether it's open or normalized. It makes no difference whatsoever. In BJOC, we leave it entirely open to the reviewer to decide whether to declare his or her identity in writing a review. You know, we won't discourage anybody from putting the name down at the end of the review, but that's left entirely to the discretion of the reviewer.
I think the question perhaps was about the reviewers being blinded to the authors, not the other way around. And again, there are pros and cons for each method, and none of them is superior. Neither of them is superior. So it's been studied, and no one method is more superior than the other.
Can I just quickly comment on that, because I don't cover it specifically in my talk. Many years ago, David Paynton, when he was editor-in-chief, actually did a small study looking at blinding the paper to the referees. So the referees were not meant to find out who wrote the paper. It turned out that when they were sent to experienced referees, 85% of the papers were identifiable anyway, because they knew who was doing that sort of work. People commonly cite their own references. So if 50% of the references are to blogs, it's probably blogs that wrote the paper. I note, however, that the Green Journal has just decided to go double blind. So not only would the referees be blinded, but they're going to go to enormous trouble to try and blind their papers. And I shall be very interested to see how this works out. It's an expensive thing to do because it takes up a lot of time. But the instructions are that if you submit a paper to the Green Journal now, you mustn't mention your institution. You mustn't say even where you did it, because that might give the game away. And I just wonder how a study where you don't even know which country it was done in is going to be interpreted. So I'm going to watch that experiment with great interest.
I have that experience as an author, Phil, for a journal, German journal. And I have to say it was quite a difficult scenario, because not only did you have to go through the paper in great detail to, you know, there's several places where you say, you know, this was a tertiary hospital in, you know, central London, it has to go, in the UK has to go, all the author names, of course. Of course, at the end, once the paper is accepted, all of that has to go back into the paper and has to seem like it was always there. So it is tricky from the journal perspective. I don't know if it is truly an improvement, but certainly an interesting experiment, as you say.
We'll see.
There's another question here. If somebody has been invited to be a co-author and then found what constitutes a falsification of data, what do you advise him to do apart from refusing it or refusing to be one? Should he report, and to whom he should report?
Well, I would say it's like any other crime. I mean, if your name has been on it, then you're in trouble, and you just have to report it before you get implicated.
Yes, yes. It's left to one's discretion, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, I would like the speakers to clarify something for the audience. I think it's important. Mentioning dual publication. We all understand that when you publish your work, when you try to present your research in a conference or in a scientific meeting, it is not considered as a dual publication when then you submit it somewhere else. But some of these congresses, they have their society books, and they would, for example, publish the abstract, and this publication would have a DOI. Would this be considered as a dual publication?
So most journals will accept short abstracts from medical congresses as not constituting a dual publication, but they need to be declared in the main paper. So the paper should say this paper was presented at X, Y, and Z conference, so that when you find the oral communication in the abstract book, you can find that that abstract was there. I will say a couple of cautionary notes, though, to the authors. There are congresses, especially in the world of biomedical engineering, where you may have been doing collaborative work between medicine and engineering, where abstracts are actually really big papers. You know, they are essentially full papers. They're certainly as large as many of our papers, 2,000, 3,000 words long, with figures and tables, etc. That, although those are abstract proceedings, they would not, you know, not be, they would constitute dual publication if you then publish the same thing elsewhere. obviously because the amount of the same information is very large. And the second word of caution is be careful, because some journals, and this is not BJOC, but some of the major journals may disallow a publication even on the basis of an abstract. So if you have something that you think is really hot and you want to send it to JAMA, for example, or the New England Journal, check very carefully before you submit it as an abstract to your local meeting, which will have an abstract book, because they may disallow it. Some of the journals may not allow that.
And again, about the dual publication, some accepted manuscripts, the journals, they would put an embargo on this accepted manuscript until it is published. So what does this embargo entail? Would still authors be allowed to present it in a scientific meeting? Are they allowed to share the news that it's accepted, or this is not allowed? And again, these very, very same journals, they would advise the authors for preprint publications, for example, Authorea or RR platforms. So if these authors have submitted their the work into these platforms, and then the work, the manuscript gets published, is this considered as a dual publication or not? Isn't this a conflict with the embargo?
This is journal specific. So some journals have signed up to peer review or pre-review publication. So you publish your paper, and it is published, for example, in medRxiv or Authorea, as you say, and it's very clear that the paper has not yet been subject to peer review, and is then goes into, for example, the the BJOC, where it is peer reviewed. Once it's accepted, the main article comes on BJOC, and the original pre-review publication disappears. If it's rejected from BJOC, it can stay on medRxiv. And it goes to a different journal wherever it's submitted. So at any one point, there's only one of those papers out. Again, you need to be very careful, because some journals will not allow you to have pre-review open access publications. So they will not consider your manuscript. That's not BJOC, but other journals will not. As far as the embargo is concerned, if your paper has been accepted by a journal and they've said, this paper is embargoed, you're not allowed to disclose the results of this paper until the 15th of July at 9 a.m., you are not allowed to do that. And that includes the press. You should not speak to the press. And the reason for that is that usually the journal is aiming to do a big press release, and they want to be the first to release the paper. And as soon as that embargo date is over, you can, of course, distribute the paper freely, but not before the embargo date. It's pretty unusual to have a strict embargo, but some of the bigger journals and some of or a very newsworthy article may have an embargo associated with it.
Thank you. We have a question here about the rules for the use of images, apart from those representing the results in posters or papers. What are the rules for the use of images, apart from those representing the results in posters or papers?
So I think the same rules would apply as part of the poster, if you like. So as we've already discussed, abstracts contributions to meetings, right? Mm-hmm. So if you submit an abstract contribution to a conference and your abstract is in the form of a poster, if the journal is happy for you to have a previously published conference abstract, then I don't see that should be a problem. Unless I'm missing something. I don't know.
It's the images. They're asking about the use of images.
No, of course, no. I mean, images can be used if they are relevant to the paper. So if you talk about ultrasound image or colposcopy or pathology or whatever, then yes, of course, they should be published if they are essential to the work. But again, journals will have limits because these are expensive to print and they take technological input and space. So some journals will allow a certain number of images.
Rasha, I wonder whether the question is about. I wonder whether the question also is about copyright. So when you publish a paper, you give the copyright to the journal. Okay, so then the copyright, the paper in some sense of course, it's still your paper, but the material, the content of the paper belongs to the journal. And therefore, if you wanted to use that same image in another paper, in a review article, for example, or in a chapter in a book, or in an illustration, as the author, generally you have allowance to use that anyway, and that's usually in the terms and conditions which you sign off. But if you were not an author, then you would need to ask for permission from the journal for using that that image. And that's not usually, it's not usually a problem if you reference the article. None of the journals would ever decline you using a figure. But
as an author, would you be able to reuse the figure even if you had already published it? Isn't this copyright infringement?
I know the chapter and verse on this. If it's in a different publisher's journal, you will need to get the permission of the original publisher. You're not allowed, even if you drew the illustration.
Yes, it's a copyright infringement.
The copyright belongs to the journal that published your original illustration, and therefore, if you want to use it within the same publisher, it's usually not much of an issue. But if you wanted to go from, say, Wiley to Elsevier, vice versa, then you must get written permission, and they may even charge for that, even though you drew up the illustration. That's just the way things are. Yes. Strictly speaking, that should also apply when you use illustrations in lectures. This remains a very tricky issue. Strictly speaking, if we use an image, as we do in our lectures, and they're being broadcast like this, you should get copyright permission. But hardly anyone ever does, and I haven't heard of anyone yet being sued for it. But having talked to a number of publishers about this, and indeed the Society of Authors and various things, it's a bit of a grey area. So all I would say is just be a bit careful about the images that you use in lectures, almost as much as in other publications. And the other thing, of course, is to make sure that there's no breach of confidentiality. If it's an X-ray or a scan, make sure that you haven't inadvertently left the name or even the date of birth or the time and date it was done, because that will allow it to be identified. That should all be removed.
Yeah, it has to be properly redacted, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Montaz, would you please introduce the next speaker? We have no more questions.
Thank you, Professor Kamel. Thank you, Aris. Our next speaker, of course, is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Sharif Abdel Fattah. Dr. Sharif Abdel Fattah will give a presentation about value-added content, promoting your paper after publication. Dr. Sharif Abdel Fattah is the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Executive Scientific Editor. He's a consultant in obstetrics and fetal medicine, South Med Hospital, Bristol, UK. He's honorary senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, executive scientific editor, British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and of course, is originally professor of OB/GYN at Ain Shams University and a dear friend. Professor Sharif, please.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen now. Right, is it shared? Can you see it? Can you see my screen, my slides?
Yes, we do.
Yes, all fine. Carry on.
Okay, good. Great. Thank you. Right. So my title is How Does BJOC Optimize the Impact and Dissemination of Your Paper? What do I mean by this? When you publish your paper, what is your aim? You want people to read it, of course. You've done lots of work to get it done, but then lots of effort to publish it. So you want to make sure that it reaches people. So this is what I'm talking about. How does the BJOC help to disseminate your paper and optimize the impact? And there are different ways of this. For example, enhancing the value of your work, make it more rich. I will talk about each one of these in details, but I will just run through the headings. So many commentaries, BJOC perspective, supporting information. These are things that accompany your paper to make it more shining, more clear. How do we help disseminate your work? And encouraging the use of your work in medical education, like journal club, CPD questions, and make it more accessible. So let's start with enhancing the value of your work. So to make it a better resource, so when you publish your work, people interested will read the results, will read the conclusion, and depending on how much interest they are. But for example, we get a mini commentary following each paper. So it's a small article, about 500 words, written by an expert in the field, and it provides another discussion of the subject of the paper. It's not a criticism, but just make it different point of view to highlight what the results, the conclusions, how can this be applied in clinical practice, and how can be looked at from different point of view. And it follows the paper at the same issue of the journal. This is interesting, the BJOC perspectives. So there are 4 types: debate, personal, legal, history. So again, when a paper, for example, can generate debate, then a small article linked to it will be debating the contents of this. And it can be from 2 authors, for and against. It can be that a particular subject inspired someone to talk about their own experiences. So there will be personal perspectives. Or it can be a legal perspective. So a condition, for example, that may arise some legal dilemmas, or there have been legal cases related to similar conditions. So there'll be a mini commentary perspective about the legal issues. Or historical, so a way of treating a particular condition or magical condition. And we'll look at publications in the BJOC, which has been since 1902, and look at how the similar conditions were managed 40, 50, 70 years ago. And these all make the content of your paper clearer and make people think about it from different points of view. We encourage authors to provide supporting information. As I said, answering one of the earlier questions, there are limits to how many images, tables, and figures you can provide in the actual journal, but you can add supporting information as an online. So you can add more tables with more details, more images, figures, or even videos that will enhance the message you would like to present. And then the second thing is how we disseminate your work. And once a paper has been published online, this is how the journals start disseminating it. And those of you who are registered with the BJOC and members of the college, you will receive alerts. So there are alerts as soon as a new issue is published, highlighting the articles in that issue, and you can sign up to to receive the alerts. It's on the BJOC website. It's free, and I will show you how. Press releases, 2 papers per month usually have some press release. It's not only in the UK media, but international media. And we have to remember that several Ops and Guide subjects are of interest to the media. I mean, no one will never need Ops and Guide issues. So lots of the work is affecting everyday people's lives. So the media is generally speaking interested in ONG matters. Podcasts. And these, when the authors, either the authors talk about their work or experts talk about their work with editors, and they are usually based on one theme or cover range of papers, but around one theme. And it will be, as I said, done by editors with experts in the field. So these can be audio podcasts, and I will show you how to reach them. And if you go on the website, on the BJOC website, you will find listen to the podcast on SoundCloud. But then there are the video abstracts provided by the authors. And if you can imagine, reading the paper it gives you some information, but listening to the author on a video abstract, talking more about it, short abstracts, but exactly explaining how they did the work and the results, and highlighting in a way that cannot be put in writing, it will give it more value and make it clearer. And again, if you go on the website, you will find the link to the video abstracts. And it's not only the abstract, but the author insights when the author talk in wider prospects about this work. And it is linked to the paper. It's promoted on the BJOC social media. And also on the content alert that's sent to the members, they receive those highlights. Going on the website, you can join the link to the author's insights. So remember again, this talk is about how did the BJOC help you make the your paper reach more audience and have more impact with them. So more audience numbers wise, but to have clearer impact and deeper impact by highlighting and clarifying what you want to say. Themed issue. We publish every year an annual themed issue. It's published in January, and it is put together by editors and sometimes guest editors. So editors with interest in a particular field, like the January last year was fetal medicine, and you can find the link to it. And this will include 10, 12 articles all related to this one particular theme. So the last one was fetal medicine. And these tend to get 50% more citations because there's a condensation of articles and research in one particular field. The past issues including pregnancy after cesarean section, urogyne, gyne-oncology, stillbirth. And the next theme issue, which I am actually editing, is about infections in pregnancy. We are still accepting papers. If you're interested, you can submit your paper for the theme issue. And when you go on the website, you will find this tab called collections. And when you browse down, it will take you to the themed issue with all the themed issues from the previous few years. Social media. BJOC is very active in social media, and I'm personally not, but some others are, particularly the younger ones. So it's Twitter in particular, Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+, and the younger colleagues are much more active than us in this. And the BJOC have very wide audience on Facebook and Twitter. And every paper will have a tweet. And this enrich the discussions and make it quicker and easier to reach thousands of people. And here are again the links to the social media. I'm sure you can access this easily. And these are the issue alerts maybe many of us receive. So there will be one of the deputy editors-in-chief or the editor-in-chief summarizing the important topics published in that issue of the journal. And again, if you go on the website, you can find the links to the alerts and you can register for it. The next item about disseminating your work is actually encouraging the use of your work in continuing medical education and CPD. Many hospitals, many departments will run journal club. Unfortunately, of course, with the COVID restriction, these things have been put on hold, but journal club. So if you read a particular article and you think it is useful for a discussion in an educational meeting, you ask one of the colleagues to summarize the paper, provide slides, provide summaries, and we do this for you. So if you go on the website, I will show you again, you will find already some papers that are highlighted by the editors as useful for journal club resources, and they have already created the slides and created the questions and the discussion that can lead for this. And the slides follow the layout of the evidence-based journal club. So clinical question, discussing the methodology, pros and cons in a critical way, analyzing the results, and then what are the implications on practice. And it stimulates discussion about all these aspects. It helps not only as a promotion of the clinical finding, but as a promotion of the research and critical appraisal of how the research was done and how are the results provided. And it encourages everyone to get into the idea of providing this research, repeating the research, and how to present your work in a better way. So these are like some of the journal club resources here. So these are the slides presented. And if you go again into the same tab of collections, you will follow the drop-down menu. It will take you to the journal club, and it will lead you to the paper that's been highlighted for the journal as suitable for journal clubs. Many of you will be aware of TOG, the obstetrician and gynecologist, which is a review articles journal published by the college. And it includes review articles followed by MCQ questions to help members and fellows with keeping up with the CPD program. Each issue will have at least one BJOC paper, sometimes two, that are suitable as a continuous development, and provided the paper and provided the questions for it and answers. So 10 MCQ questions. Again, this increases the visibility and increases the dissemination of the work. Yes, so as I said, the BJOC editors will select suitable papers. They will ask the authors to provide 10 MCQ questions, and they will be published in each issue of the talk. They are published 4 times a year, quarterly. Finally, I will talk about increasing the accessibility of your work. So how to make it easy for people to find it. Of course, you can go on the website, but also there's the BJOC app, which is really as good as the website, including all the information. It's free to download, available for the Apple and the Android. And it's very easy to navigate. I do encourage you to play around with it, because it allows you for the keyword notifications, the contents availability. It's really quick access on your phone. Other things are the virtual issues, and the virtual issues collect, it's like the theme issue, but it's a virtual theme issue in that it collects papers and research and guidelines relevant to one particular subject and put it together in one virtual issue. And if you go on the website, you will find this virtual issue about termination of pregnancy from all aspects, and it will collect, if you're interested to know more about this, you will find lots and lots of articles from original research to CPD papers, to perspectives, to journal club, to guidelines, supplements about the same issue. Open access journal. The BJOC is not an open access journal. Initially, you have to have registration to be able to access the articles, but then all the contents are free after 12 months. And every issue, there is one paper that is free to view from the beginning, and the editor-in-chief will decide on this one. But then, as I said, later, 12 months later, all the contents are free. So just to summarize, how does Wiley, the publishers, promote your paper? There are different ways, that the social media, the apps, indexing, the enhanced PDF, and different other formats. And you can actually, when you publish a paper, you can get free access to 10 colleagues from the beginning. Search engine. You really, that's now your role of how to help disseminate your work. And you may assume that when people look for work, look for academic papers, for published papers, they go to PubMed or similar things. But actually, Google will direct you to 50% of the traffic at least go through Google. So just a Google search. So how to increase your article discoverability? Basically, make it easier for people to find. So if I am searching for a particular subject, I will just think, what would people put on Google to try to find this particular subject, and then make sure your paper provide this. So create a search engine friendly title. So if you're talking about termination of pregnancy, then make sure that the termination of pregnancy is in the title. Include 1-2 keywords related to your topic. Keep your title short and focused. Again, in the abstract, place the essential findings and keyword in the first 2 sentences of the abstract. Repeat your keywords several times. So if you're talking about cancer cervix or cancer ovary or something else, diabetes in pregnancy, so make sure it is in your abstract repeated several times. So when people search in Google, it will appear straight away. And also use the keyword throughout your article, make it easier for people to find. Build links, so link to your article across your social media, networking, LinkedIn, institutional sites, and let people know about it. It's all easy, it's all on your phone. If you can just know how to find it and enhance, as I said, using the appropriate keywords and the appropriate wording, the appropriate format, it will be easier for people to find. That's my last slide, just to say that there are so many ways BJOC can help you, and you can help yourself to get it circulated. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Sharif. It was my pleasure to listen and watch your presentation. Actually, there are 2 questions. They are not really specific to your presentation, but they are for the whole panel. So I hope that you can help us with. The first question would be, would you please clarify about what is supplements in a journal?
Sorry, I seem to have lost something. Can you see me?
The question is, would you please clarify about supplements in a journal?
The supplements are the thing that cannot be really added to the paper because there are just limits to how much you can add to the paper. Sorry, Mumtaz, I just lost. I can't see actually.
Sharif, I think you need to stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to exit screen share.
Sorry, I'm trying to do this and I feel lost. Sorry. Can you still see my screen or?
Yes, yes, we still can.
Right.
I will stop it for you.
Yes, please. Yeah, this will be helpful. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah. So the supplements are, as I said, the items that there are limits. They cannot be put on the actual paper on the journal. So most journals will have limits like 3 tables, 4 tables, 2 or 1 figure, images, 1 or 2. But if you add more, if you want to add more, and they are valuable to the actual paper, then you can add them as a supplement. So they will be online, available online with links. So not printed, obviously, but not even on the online version, on the online actual paper, but they will be hyperlinked online.
I think the usually supplements are like photographs or videos or,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
things that cannot be really put into the journal or the paper itself. Yeah.
That's right. So the videos, of course, you can't. And if they are helpful to like a surgical technique or some other technique, but also sometimes the tables, if you want to present more table than what is allowed for the journal, either number-wise or size-wise, because some tables can be really big and cannot be printed. So these can be put as supplements. So it's not only videos, it can be figures, it can be tables, it can be graphs, or images of ultrasound, colposcopy, surgical procedures, whatever.
There is another question, actually, it is to the whole panel. Professor B. Lynch introduced the B. Lynch suture. Immediately after that, dozens of modifications techniques, such as Heyman, CHO, Pereira, etc. Is it ethical to publish a technique under the name of the author, or should you mention that it is a modified B. Lynch technique?
I think the best person to answer this is Phil, because Phil actually is supervising Heyman. So I'll let Phil answer this.
Yeah, I think it's all, as always, it's about transparency. So if you describe what you actually did, don't just say I did a B. Lynch suture. If you want a generic term, I would say uterine compression suture would cover a lot of these modalities. But ideally, you need to just be specific about what you did. And I think that's true of most scientific papers.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sharif. I think this will be the end of the first part of the webinar. I'll hand the moderation to Professor Nouri and Dr. Benjamin to start the moderation of the second part. Professor Nouri.
Unmute yourself, Dr. Amr.
Thank you, Professor Mumtaz. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Chien, who is BJOC Deputy Editor-in-Chief, and he's a consultant honorary senior lecturer in Ops and Gynae at 9 Wells Hospitals and Medical School of Dundee in Scotland. Dr. Patrick is going to talk about why should you review for a journal and what to consider before accepting an invitation.
Thank you, Professor Nouri. Nouri, I'm going to share my screen just now. You can see my screen now. So there's another group of individuals that are important for the journal, and that would be peer reviewers. So in the first part of this webinar so far, we've talked about the ethics on how to conduct a clinical study, how to write up a paper, and how to promote your paper after that. In this part of this webinar, which is relatively short compared to the first part, we're going to talk about peer review. And that's going to be done between me and Professor Steele. So I'm going to talk about why you should review for a journal. Hopefully I can convince you this is an important thing to do, and what you should consider before you accept an invitation to review, and also what you can also do to prepare yourself before you're being invited to review a manuscript. So the first reason why I think you should participate in peer review.
Patrick, may I just interrupt you briefly? Prof, I'm not sure, is everyone else seeing Patrick's slides, or is it just
we can't see his screen.
We can't see your screen, Patrick. It says you started screen sharing, but there's no PowerPoint. Maybe if you unshare and reshare, sometimes that solves the problem.
Double click to enter full screen.
Can you see
yes,
that screen
now I can see it. So if you go to full, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, so the first reason why I think you should participate as a peer reviewer is, first of all, as an altruism reason. So what you should try and consider yourself as a peer reviewer is not really to try and reject papers, but to try and improve papers for the authors. So even if the paper isn't accepted for a journal for publication, by having the paper going through a peer review process, that paper will improve for subsequent submission somewhere else. So what we try to look for, or what the authors are trying to hope for, is for you to try and tease out some of the different perspectives of the study, whereby the study design may not be highlighted, for example, and also in the discussion section of the manuscript. For example, certain aspects of the data might be important, but not given sufficient importance in your discussion. We're also keen for you to identify things like errors, for example. So if some of the numbers in the tables doesn't quite correspond in the manuscripts, it is important that this is all picked up and corrected as much as possible. Some reviewers also are experts in statistical analysis, and obviously if there's any deficiency or strength in the data analysis, we would also be keen to obviously receive those reports. What we're not too worried about is actually the language itself. We don't really want you to write the whole paper to improve the language, because we have technicians who can actually edit the language itself. But what we're more interested in is whether the study design and the discussion is accurate in the data interpretation. The second reason why you would want to peer review is that of obligation. So because when you submit a paper to a journal and it's being peer reviewed by others to improve your paper, you have an obligation to do that for other people as well, so that their papers also get improved. The third reason why peer review is important is that by undertaking peer review, you then expose yourself to some new ideas that other people are undertaking elsewhere in the world. So for example, you may come across a study which, after looking at the results, that gives you some idea to mount another similar study, not exactly the same, but it might be something where you have generated a new hypothesis, and then you can test that hypothesis, and that provides you with new ideas for new research for yourself. By doing that as well, you're obviously going to be aware of any recent trends in research, for example, whether there is interest in funding for research into, say, prenatal diagnosis, for example, and that helps you in seeking grants successfully for your research portfolio. Because you are reading other people's work, that also increase your knowledge of science itself, and that obviously is a benefit to yourself. In reading other people's writing, you also improve your own writing. So obviously we talk about how research should be conducted and how it should be written up. There is a skill to it. You probably sussed out by now that the skill in writing is to be able to write as precisely and concisely as possible. So editors don't like long manuscripts. They much prefer short manuscripts. And if you read some other people's work, that will give you an idea how to structure your writing and try and get a message across as extensively and concisely as possible. So as William Faulkner has written here, you should read everything, whether it's trash, whether it's classics, whether it's good or bad, see how other people do it, read it, absorb it, and then be able to write yourself. The last reason I think why you should peer review for others is for your own professional development. So in reading other people's work, you start to network with other established researchers. That allows you to collaborate your work with others and then come up with new ideas between the two of you to shape the future research as well. There's an organization called Publons. So this is a commercial website which offers free service for other people to track and verify, and as well for you to showcase your peer review work. So every time when you peer review for a journal that is affiliated to Publons, and BJOC is one of them, there'll be a record of you having done a peer review for a specific journal over a different time scale. So over the years, you could track how many papers you peer reviewed, and obviously that provides an indication to the scientific community as to what contribution do you make to science itself. And as of March 2018, there's at least 100,000 reviewers for Wiley journals registered on Publons itself. I'll say a little bit more about Publons later on. In the UK, we have to undergo annual appraisals, and your CPD activity is part of the evidence used for your appraisal. So you have to be able to satisfy that you are undergoing satisfactory personal development every year in order for you to allow to practice medicine in the UK. So again, by reviewing articles, you can get CPD points, and that also will provide evidence for you to obviously pass your appraisal every year. I presume a similar type of system also exists in the Middle East. BJOC also published a list of all articles at the end of each calendar year. So we put down the names of all the people that we used for referees. And again, people can also use this as evidence for their appraisals. We also acknowledge, or we actually write to the top 50 reviewers we have for each year and thank them for their contribution to our journal. So again, people can also use this for their appraisal evidence. Now, before you accept an invitation to referee a paper, obviously there are a few things you have to think about. First thing is you have to look at the paper and look at the topic of the paper itself and decide whether you have the expertise to review the manuscript. If you don't, either you need to read up the literature before you attempt to review it, or you can politely decline it and explain the reason why this may not be an appropriate manuscript for you to review. Even you have the expertise for it, you also have to decide whether you can provide an unbiased review. So in that sense, some journals that, as Phil has indicated, the Green Journal will blind you to the researchers, but that doesn't always work in practice. So if whether you know for sure or you can guess the authors of the submitted paper, you need to be certain that you can provide an unbiased review without compromising the submission itself. If you have a conflict of interest, just as you have a conflict of interest when you write the paper, you should also declare it. So I don't need to go through all the conflict of interest that has already been discussed in this webinar. Again, the same message applies. If in doubt, I would declare it. You should leave it to the editors and the journal office to decide whether the conflict of interest is sufficiently large enough to exclude you as a reviewer. You don't have to make that judgment. You just have to make the declaration and then leave others to make that judgment. An important thing to decide whether to accept an invitation to review is whether you can do it on time. So in BJOC, we give you a period of 2 weeks. If once you accept the invitation, we expect your review to be available to us within that time period. We obviously can be flexible if some unforeseen circumstances turn up. But what we would say to you that if there's any immediate reason as to why you can't meet this deadline, you need to contact the editorial office and ask for an extension. Or if it's going to be a long extension, then you could always ask for the manuscript to be reassigned. We don't mind referees coming up to say that they can't provide a report in 2 weeks, provided they let us know, so that we can obviously immediately reassign the manuscript to another referee. And this is only being fair to the authors, because obviously they're keen to get a decision from us as quick as possible. If you can't meet it, then you should decline that offer, obviously. My only advice to you is that if you don't have any of the above impediment to review, you should always try to accept the review, because you find that you learn a lot of things from other people's work, and also how to write a paper as well. So always try and make time to try and write a review for any journal. So before you become a reviewer for BJOC, there's a few things you could easily do. The first thing is that you should try and log on to our document management system. So BJOC uses a document management system called Scholar One, and this is the website to get onto this website. Once you click onto the website, you'll be asked to log in, or you may already have an account with us. If you do have an account with us, it is important that you try and update your profile as much as possible. So this includes things like your email contact address, your area of expertise, because that could change from time to time, and it's important that those information is as accurate as possible for us, in order for us to be able to contact you if we decide to choose you as a reviewer for a particular manuscript. If you're not a reviewer, if you don't have an account with us, you can still register as an account holder and obviously provide all the clinical information that we require. It doesn't matter whether you are a known expertise within a specific area or you're a new researcher, because quite often we sometimes use untested names to provide a peer review. Because that's the only way we can try and expand our pool of reviewers. And obviously, if editors were to use an untested names in the first instance, then all we do is just put to put an additional reviewer, so that we always have some backup experienced reviewers to fall back on if for some reason the untested reviewer doesn't provide a satisfactory report. But everybody has to start somewhere. So I would encourage you to try and register with us, so that there's always a chance you may get picked, and that will be your chance to start as a reviewer. Obviously, you need to know how to use the document management system that we have in BJOC. And once you click onto the website, if you go on to the Help tab at the top right-hand corner and click on it, you'll be taken to another web page whereby it says resources by role, and you find the specific role that we are talking about, which is a reviewer. You click on it and it'll give you a PDF document to teach you how to use the Scholar One and in submitting your report for your peer review. In other words, it'll tell you how to download the manuscript for you to read, and then how you should populate the various fields in your review report. It also provides you with a video clip, a short video clip as well, on how to use Scholar One. Now, Phil is going to talk a little bit about resources on how to write a review, and I'm going to leave that to him. So this particular bit here is only specific to BJOG. You have to, obviously, I would encourage you to do that for other journals as well, because obviously the more journals you register with, the more likely you may then end up as a reviewer for at least some journals. And once you've done that, all you do is just wait for an invitation to review. My slide is not moving now for some reason. 1 minute.
Professor, can you stop sharing and reshare again, please?
Okay. I'm just going to move down. So the last, one of the other, this slide is to tell you what training you can provide for yourself before you start your review career. One of it I mentioned earlier on was Publons. So you can sign up to Publons Academy, and you can see that's the website for this. And this gives you a free online peer review course, and it consists of 10 modules, which is completely free. And at the end of that 10 modules, you'll be given a certificate of completion of the course. So this is quite a useful thing to do in order to obviously improve your peer review skills. You can also attend workshops like this. And in some cases, you may have a mentor to help you out. So in some situations when BJOG asks for a peer reviewer, the reviewer may then might be too busy to write the review, but might suggest using one of the less experienced researcher in the department to help write the review. Normally, we would ask, that would be okay, as long as obviously we are notified of it at the office so that we know in advance, and that you could use the more senior researcher as a mentor to help you write your first couple of reviews. So in summary, peer review skill is an important skill, and it's a very useful skill to develop, and I strongly encourage you to do that because it helps you to improve your own research skills and how to write your own paper as well. You should register to be a reviewer with as many journals as possible. Obviously, we would like you to register with us as well. And always try to accept an invitation to review whenever you get given one. It will provide you with some useful research contacts as well in doing this. And you never know, you might find that this might be a career path to be a journal editor, because that's how I ended up being an editor for BJOG, is initially being accepted as being invited to be a reviewer and then asked to join the editorial team after that. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any few short questions before Phil's presentation.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick, for this really elegant presentation. And one of the questions really, if someone registered to become a reviewer, what is the chance of, what are the criteria to accept this reviewer, to be a reviewer? And what's the chance of this if they have no experience whatsoever before?
So the criteria as to whether you should accept the invitation to review as I said early on, is dependent on whether you have sufficient expertise to review the article, and also whether you have sufficient amount of time to provide a timely article, and whether there's any potential conflict of interest. That's all been covered early on. In terms of your probability of being asked to do a review, that varies with each individual experience, I would say. The only way to maximize that chance is to register with as many journals as possible. And it doesn't matter whether you're a well-known researcher or fairly unknown. The more you register with journals, the more likely you're going to be asked. So in BJOC, as I explained early on, we normally have at least 2 clinical reviewers. Sometimes we ask for a statistical reviewer, but that's a different panel altogether. In asking for 2 reviewers, quite often, sometimes editors might sometimes deliberately pick an unknown name. So even if you are one of the 2 reviewers, it doesn't really matter whether your reviewer is satisfactory to us or not, because there's always a second backup. And in any case, sometimes people also use a 3rd reviewer so that there's 2 backups. Now, Phil will talk to you shortly about how we also grade your review once we get the report. So obviously, if for some reason your review turns up trumps and you get a high score, that would lead to more invitation later on. But I'll let Phil just tell you how we grade those reviews.
And what about the online peer review course in Pablons? And there are 10 modules, I understand. And how long does it take to finish these modules, you know? And I know it varies between one person to another, you know, but yes. I'm talking the average time. You know.
Yeah, I haven't done it myself, I have to admit. But because they're free and it's online, so it means that you can do it, you don't have to do it all in one go, and you can always do it in your own speed and your own time. I would think they're not, I mean, people who write this kind of courses usually also understands that, you know, you have to write a course. All these modules can't be too long, because if it's too long, people just switched off after a while and they will never complete the module. So I would think they are written in a reasonable length so that it can be completed within, you know, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes or for each module. But remember, you don't have to do all 10 modules in one go. You know, you can split it up over over several days at your own spare time.
Okay. Right, I will pass actually the word to Dr. Wafa Benjamin to introduce Professor Phil, please.
Thank you, Professor Amr. Thank you, Dr. Chin. It gives me great honor to introduce our next speaker, Professor Phelps Steer, the BJOG Emeritus Editor. Professor Steer is the Emeritus Professor of Obstetrics, Imperial College London, Academic Department for Obstetrics and Gynecology at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. He's going to talk about how to structure a review and support tools, conflicts of interest, and
confidentiality.
Confidentiality, yes. Okay, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a great pleasure to join so many Egyptian colleagues this evening, and well done for sticking with it. I see we still got 330 people on the list, so congratulations to them. The great advantage of speaking last is that you have the last word to some extent. The disadvantage, of course, is that the people who preceded you have given half your lecture. But anyway, what we'll do is we'll skip over the ones that are a bit repetitious. But if you see a repetition, it's probably because we all think it's important. So you can take something from that. So let me share. There we go. So you should be seeing my slides now.
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I want to just get out of the way is any potential conflicts of interest. They're on the journal website in great and exquisite detail if you're interested in reading them. So I shall now pass on. In fact, you can read about everybody's conflict of interest on the website, so it's all there. So there are a couple of fundamentals that we have to be in place before we get going. The first thing is, has already been alluded to, you need the appropriate time. How long is that? I would say for somebody not that experienced at doing refereeing, you need to leave 4 to 5 hours. I'm actually a bit more experienced than perhaps the average person, and I do 3 or 4 per week. And I don't always take 4 or 5 hours. It depends. I'm sometimes very familiar with the work, but 4 to 5 hours is a reasonable time. You obviously need internet access. So that's essential. And helpful, however, are multiple screens. Now, this is just where I'm sitting at the moment. I'm just sitting looking at these screens as we communicate. And on the left is the paper that I'm refereeing. And then here's my notes. This is going to be my report on that paper with references. And then here I've got PubMed, because I'm always looking up to see if other people have published this stuff before. So a quick search on PubMed is pretty well essential for most refereeing. You've got to see what else has been done in this field. And if somebody's done a nice review, you might find that unfortunately somebody published it in another journal just 2 weeks ago. So you need to know about that. This is Equator, which has got all this. So we'll skip over that because you've already heard about that. So how do you actually do it practically? Well, the first thing is to sit down somewhere comfortable that you're not going to fall asleep, and then read the manuscript thoroughly and make notes as you go along. Now, I actually usually read them on the screen, as you've seen, and that makes it easy for me to make the notes on the other side as I'm going through. But if you're sitting in a chair, then have a notepad, because lots of thoughts and ideas about the paper will occur to you when you're first reading it, and then when you go back to it, you'll have forgotten some of them. So make a note of those as you go through. And then you'll end up with a nice long list of notes that you can then put into some sort of sensible order. If you find there's something missing, then contact the editorial office. Don't write to the authors. Very important, you do everything through our editorial office. Don't ever contact the authors directly for anything. That's considered to be very bad news. If you're concerned about the research or the publication ethics, then obviously contact us at the editorial office immediately. We routinely say to people, would you mind reviewing any revisions of the paper? And if you've made really important criticisms, you'll probably want to know what the author's response was. So please try and say yes to that if you can. It can get a bit tedious, but it's very helpful to the authors. It's helpful to us, and you might learn the way they've answered your questions. So you need to consider the following aspects. So when you're reading this paper, have at the back of your mind this series of questions. Is this a paper that you would be interested in downloading and reading? Is it original? How important is it? Obviously, the scientific quality is extremely important, and that's where the reporting standards of the relevant guideline come in, and I'll mention that again briefly. Will it be cited? Now, as a journal, we're very interested to know if you think this is something that's going to be cited by lots of other workers in the field, or whether you think actually this is such a minority interest that no one will be interested. Now, you can review the topic. I've already mentioned PubMed. You can use Scopus or Google Scholar. Any of those will do. My favorite is always PubMed. And you've heard about the Equator Network. And I'm going to quickly whiz over this because it's got all the various reporting guidelines that you might need to refer to. Have they done the paper correctly? And there is also a peer reviewing research toolkit, which is very helpful when you're starting. So as well as the Publons one, you can look through this toolkit. The registration issue has already been mentioned. It's absolutely essential that randomized controlled trials are prospectively registered. But since 2005, but since 2008, you'll notice that the importance of registration is that it now includes any research group that assigns human participants to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate their effects on health. So it's not just randomized trials, it's any study where you're doing something to somebody. You will be required to have registered that prospectively. Now, there are lots of registries, but the preeminent one is clinicaltrials.gov. It's one of the USA's major contributions to science. It's free, which is very important. It's also very reliable. It's easy to access. So I would certainly recommend that as a first port of call. The EU have their own clinical trials register that's not so user-friendly, actually, I find. WHO have one. Prospero is for reporting meta-analyses, potential meta-analyses. So it's not the same, it's not for clinical trials. So there's clinicaltrials.gov, very simple. You'll recognize the website. Here's the European Union Clinical Trials Register. It now interestingly says that the status of studies in GB is no longer updated from the 1st of January 2021. And those of you who follow the news in Europe will know this is all down to Brexit, which some of us deeply regret, but there we are. Here's the WHO website again, ICTRP, and that again is acceptable. Here's Prospero. It's run by the National Institutes for Health Research in the UK, and it's for fast-tracking registration of protocols for studies. So if you're planning to do a study prospectively, you can register it at Prospero. The advantage of that is that you can look on this website and see if somebody else is already going to do what you're going to do, because then you might think twice. You don't want to duplicate. Okay, so coming back to the practicalities. Remember that when you're filling in the website sections, where it says remarks for the editor, they are confidential. So you can say, I think this is a very poor paper, or I don't think it should be published, or whatever. You can express yourself freely, but don't put that in the remarks for the author. We don't want you to say this paper should or should not be published, because actually that's the decision for the editors to make. You're to give them advice about the pros and cons, that what's good and what's not so good about the paper. And in the remarks to the editor, you can say what you think, but please don't put that in the remarks to the author. If you do, actually, we just edit it out anyway, because we don't want the author to be confused by the referee saying one thing and the editor saying something else. It's quite nice if you can write your comments in numbered sequence. It makes it easy for the person replying, saying, with reference to this referee, my answer to point 1 is this, my answer to point 2 is this, my answer to point 3 is this, and so on. Now, if you make a particular criticism of a scientific point in the paper, it's nice to give a reference to back up your point of view. But don't just use your own references, because you'll give yourself away if you want to remain anonymous. That's fine if you want to say, you want to sign your referee's thing at the bottom. Lots of juniors are wary of doing that if they're reporting on a paper that's written by somebody senior. So it's entirely appropriate if they wish to remain anonymous. But in that case, don't give yourself away by putting lots of your own references in. Always try and be constructive. Try and say what can improve the paper, not just what's wrong with it. Okay? You need to be professional and respectful, use appropriate language. We have had referees who've written good reports, but then we've actually had to ask their permission to rewrite them because they're so rude. So we don't like to send back a rude referee's report. So strengths and weaknesses you need to look at. That's always a good idea. And you've already heard about these things that you need to do from the previous speakers. So things to think about once you've read the paper and you've made your comments, and then you've done a systematic analysis of the paper. Finally, you need to think about things in a practical way. Is there anything new? Does the paper make sense? Is it something you could imagine doing or somebody else doing, or is it a bit unbelievable? Is it going to be something that other people will want to cite? You can comment in the referee's report saying this needs attention to the English. We don't want you to rewrite it or whatever, but if you think it's badly written or you didn't understand parts of it, then it's helpful to say that. Are the graphs necessary? Are the references appropriate? These are all just little checklists that you can go through to finish off your referee's report. You've heard these from Mike Marsh. Is it ethical? Are the methods appropriate? Etc. You've heard all these things before. So I'm going to repeat this. Make your recommendations regarding publication to the editor, not to the authors. Write politely. Don't make pejorative comments. And if you have suspicions, make sure that you communicate with us in a confidential manner yourself. Now, conflicts of interest. These are the sorts of people who could be conflicted. If somebody you're working with, obviously, somebody who trained you that you may wish not to comment on them, somebody you have trained, or your collaborators, etc. So these are the obvious potential conflicts of interest. They don't necessarily disqualify you from writing comments on a paper or refereeing it, provided that you actually declare it in your report, at least to the editors, not necessarily to the authors of the work. If you happen to know somebody who's about to publish something similar, then that's useful information, but might perhaps disqualify you from writing a report because of a conflict of interest. Now, other practical issues. You've heard it mentioned that it's okay for a trainee to do a referee's report. That's absolutely fine, but no one else should see the manuscript except the referee who's been allocated, unless you've got permission for that. So if you want somebody else to look at it as well as you, that's fine, but you must get permission. You must tell us first. Don't show it to them and then ask us. Ask us first if it's okay to show it to someone else. And if the person doing the report is actually a trainee, we must know that they're a trainee, because that will be taken into account. Obviously, you mustn't just pinch somebody else's work. That goes without saying. So Patrick mentioned that we actually score reviewers, and we do. We give scores on 3 areas. Firstly, if they decline lots of reports, lots of referees' requests, then obviously we mark them down. That's not very helpful to us. We want the review to be done in reasonable speed. Usually I try and do them within 48 to 72 hours if I can, because then I don't have a backlog. The worst thing is you can allow a backlog of referees' reports, and then it's a bit daunting when you suddenly realize one weekend you've got 5 reports to do. So it's a good idea, and you get lots of brownie points if you turn them around really quickly. And then we actually score the quality of the review from average to good to excellent and so on. Now, once you've sent in your referee's report, what happens? Well, you'll get a letter back from the editor with the copying what he's sent to the authors and then attaching the referee's comments. So that's really useful because you can find out what the editor thinks about it, and you can learn from the other reviewers. That's really useful. You get your CPD points, and think of it as a real-life high-stakes journal club. You've already heard about Podlons, so I'm not going to say any more about that. I actually don't go on Podlons because I already get enough requests to referee anyway. But for people starting out, it's not a bad idea. So finally, being asked to be a referee is actually a compliment. It's a good way to keep up to date, as you've already heard, and it can even be enjoyable. Okay, so stop sharing. And that's my bit done. I can answer one of the questions that's already come in, and that somebody said, when we submit a paper, should we suggest the name of referees? There is actually a slot in BJOC now that says, would you like to nominate referees? And in some journals, they say, who would you not like to send this to? Now, I've always been a bit cautious about that because I've always assumed that if someone recommends referees, that it's because they know them and they know they're going to give them a favorable review. So I've been a bit suspicious and I haven't used them very much. But when I've done, I've actually been quite surprised that very often they won't do the report, perhaps because they see it as a conflict of interest. And if somebody said, please don't send them to this referee, I usually do just to see what the referee is going to say about it. I may then disregard their comments. I take them with a pinch of salt because there may be some animosity, but nonetheless, it does pique my interest. So in general, it's not really that important a requirement, in my opinion. You don't need to suggest referees. We have pretty good ways of finding appropriate referees anyway. Okay, any other comments?
Thank you so much, Professor Steer. Thank you for giving us shedding the light on the important aspects of this important peer review. I think the message was very clear. We have only one question in the chat right. from Dr. Younes Bakri. He's asking, have you ever encountered an OB/GYN editor or editor-in-chief who committed plagiarism? And what is the situation then?
If the editor themselves plagiarizes a paper.
Yeah, it's a difficult question.
I haven't come across that particular problem, although many, many years ago, I did work with an editor-in-chief who actually allowed himself to be a guest author on a paper, which subsequently turned out to be fraudulent, and he had to resign. So that adds piquancy to the comment that it's not good for your career. Somebody's just commented, actually, it's something we might add on. The Publon's webpage states that it's now changed to Web of Science, and that's true. When we get suggestions of referees from editorial manager, then it now comes up as the Web of Science rather than Publon's.
Okay, there's another question. Is it the reviewer's responsibility to conduct a literature search to check the novelty of the subject?
Yes. Simple answer.
Okay.
Yes. It is essential, because if you're going to put on your report that this is a novel work and no one has done it before and it's great, and then it turns out that there are 4 or 5 publications about the same subject in the last year, then it will just give the wrong message that you're not a good reviewer. So before you say something, either it's positive or negative, just make sure that you're supported by this.
I absolutely agree with Sharif, and I think Phil's point about it being a compliment and an honor to be asked to be a referee, but it is also a responsibility. Remember that the editor may look after articles in all areas of obstetrics and gynecology. They cannot possibly be a contents experts in all areas that they are an editor on. So they are looking to you as the referee to be the contents expert, to be their eyes and ears, and to give the editor good advice as to whether this article is true, whether the work is new, and whether it's clinically relevant. So there's those sort of key questions that Phil was talking about. So it is an important responsibility, and it's easy to sort of say, oh, I've been asked to be a referee and be very happy about it. But it is an important task, and scientific fraud, when it occurs, or when papers come out and they're not good, often you can track that back somehow to a referee that really didn't maybe do as good a job as they could have done.
One more point is that it is a good idea in general just to know what's in the literature about the paper you're reviewing. This is particularly more important when authors make claims about being the first, or this is the largest study to do this, or we are the first people to find this. I think that's important, just to find out what they say is correct, and very often it's not. When they say we are the largest, then you do search and you find actually larger papers with more participants have been published, but they just rely on people who will not notice this.
It's probably a good principle never to say this is the first paper on, because actually, if you go back to BJOC 1902, you may well find something that's relevant. So at the best, you should say, as far as we are aware, this is the first paper on this, but it's probably best not to, because it doesn't really add anything anyway. I mean, that's going to be a decision that the readers and the editors are going to make for themselves.
What is the situation if I am a reviewer reviewing a paper, and then I found that another paper being published in PubMed 2 weeks earlier, and then looking at the trial registry, I find that the current author that I'm reviewing his paper, that he registered this trial before the other paper, and they are having the same methodology. What's the situation in this case?
Bad luck, isn't it, really? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Do you, Aris or Sharif?
Well, I mean, there are often trials, unlike systematic reviews and meta-analyses, where if you look at Prospero and someone's doing exactly the same meta-analysis that you are planning to do, it's probably a good idea to shift to something else, as Phil said. But trials are a little different, because rarely are trials going to be completely conclusive on all outcomes, and rarely will they be completely identical. So it will often happen that there are a number of trials going on in the same area at the same time, and you know, whoever comes out first comes out first. Obviously, it will decrease the interest in that second trial, as you say, if a bigger or more important or, you know, even equally good trial has just been published. It does reduce the interest. Although in general, if it's a proper randomized controlled trial done according to the protocol, properly registered, it is difficult to reject those papers if they're done well. Generally speaking, regardless of the results, actually, even if the results are negative, if it's been properly registered, if it's been properly done according to the protocol, you know, it's important information and has to be published. Not all trials will be, but, you know, the majority, I think, would.
And of course, we don't base our clinical practice and our guidelines, national guidelines, NICE guidelines, we don't base them on one study or one trial. I mean, we have to find that this was done by different groups and large number of patients, and it has been replicated before we consider it as a standard practice and even go into standard clinical practice.
With randomized control trial, another reason why we would publish more than one study, or there's a need to publish more than one study, is the fact that the data can be used for systematic reviews, you see.
Okay, do you think that editors, they have some, you know, preference or maybe bias, you know, to research coming from Europe, for example, rather than from other continents such as Africa or Asia?
Honestly, I think they do. I'm not sure that I can document that, but I think they're almost in most areas there is some even how do you say it, Phil, unconscious bias. I think there may be some bias. That is also true, though, Amr, that many times the governance and the design of trials in Europe need to be at such a high standard that often the quality, this is a big generalization, but often the quality may be higher or maybe perceived to be higher, the number may be larger, etc., than a trial that is outside the sort of Europe or the USA. But you do sometimes feel that. I have to be honest as an editor. I wouldn't, and I passionately believe that we should promote research from all corners of the globe. But you do sometimes get the feeling that there may be an unconscious bias. But this is my personal perception. I don't know what Phil or some of the other editors feel.
Yeah, I think recently we've actually been trying to apply a bit of positive discrimination in favor of areas of the world that are up and coming, you know, China being one example.
Yeah.
But then it's difficult to disentangle one's prejudices from the fact that sometimes the English is not good, or they don't quite understand some of the procedures that we would normally take for granted.
I think, again, when we discuss papers coming from less sort of known research countries, what makes it more in favor if this research is really helping improve women's health in that country, which is actually will have more value and better clinical implications for that population and for the women's health in similar populations. This will be, of course, reviewed favorably. Of course, we have to keep the standards of the journal, but I think others will agree with me that there can be a bit of leeway for decent research coming from less active countries if they have a good message.
There's a couple of interesting questions that have come in. One was, in the past, journals have criticized for only publishing studies with positive results. And that brings up an important point. When I'm talking to people about prospectively doing research, I always say to them, one way to look at your hypothesis or your question is it just as important if the answer is negative as if it's positive? If the answer is it's equally important both ways, then it's good research. If it's only important if it's positive, then it perhaps might be something you should pass on to someone else to do. Because if it's negative, what are you going to do with it? just to give you a simple example of a negative paper that would be very interesting would be, for example, is the use of quinine effective against coronavirus? And then you could ask ex-President Trump to be a referee, because a negative result is very important. No, quinine is of no use whatsoever in treating coronavirus. The other interesting question was, can you publish the same paper in 2 journals in 2 languages? And this is actually something I've had to deal with, so I can answer that. It depends on how widely disseminated that language is. And in this case, it was a particular sort of Central European come Asian paper in a language that many of us had not even heard of. And it was published in a journal with a very, very small circulation. And the authors had got it translated, and it did seem to be of genuine interest. So in the end, we did publish it with a comment that it had previously been published in this other journal, in this other language. But there was a value in exposing it to the wider community because it was now written in English. But that would be a very exceptional case. Yeah. If it was written in Spanish, then we wouldn't be interested, because probably there's just as many people read it in Spanish as in English.
Or in Arabic.
Yeah.
There is a question from Professor Yusuf Abu Alwan saying, can he request the master sheet of the research to be sure that it is done properly?
Who's going to answer that? Patrick?
I suppose you can always request it, but whether it'll be forthcoming is another matter. People who do systematic review quite often ask for that anyway. But I've done a few systematic reviews, and I can tell you that you don't always get a positive response when you request for raw data. One of the presentations early on, I think the one by Sharif, talks about all these supporting documents and supplementary documents. We do encourage, and if authors want to put their raw data up in a form of a spreadsheet as a supplementary material, we would publish it electronically. That's not a problem. It's a question of whether people want to do that or not, that's all. I suppose if you want to be seen to be as transparent as possible, then that's something that you may wish to do, just to demonstrate that you're being as open as possible with everybody.
Yeah.
I think the practical answer is probably that the referee shouldn't make that request, but they should suggest to the journal that they make that request. And we did actually have a case, didn't we, in the last 18 months or so, where we actually requested the original data, had it reanalyzed by a specialist statistician, and decided that we were doubtful about its veracity. So that does happen, but I don't think it's something a referee would get directly involved in. That's very much an editorial function.
Absolutely, and some of the other journals now request data to be put into a depository. So some of the large journals, in particular for trials, anonymized data, of course, and they do often will request the data to go to the journal. And as Patrick said, I mean, one of the best ways of I suppose if anyone has suggested any worry about the veracity of that, one of the best things you can do is remove the columns that have the patient name or any other identifiers and submit it as supplementary material. There's really no reason not to do that if it's allowed by the ethics board, and if no one else, if it just contains the data that are within the paper.
This is a bit of a specialist area. I was actually involved in a webinar on Wednesday evening discussing this particular issue, because pseudo-anonymization means taking all the obvious identifiers, the name and the address and all that sort of thing. But statistically, if you have more than 5 variables on somebody, you have to have a very large number before it becomes impossible to identify someone. And I have in fact been on a paper where we had to get specialist permission to look at a large pseudo-anonymized data set, which had a lot of variables in it. And then by matching up various characteristics, we were able to identify the children born to these particular women, even though the data set was pseudo-anonymized. So that's a useful rule of thumb. If you've got more than 5 variables, an expert statistician could probably work out by, for example, accessing publicly available databases on people's credit records, council records, etc. It can be done. And so you need to be careful about it. It's a rather specialist area at the moment, covered by GDPR or the general data protection regulations. So it's a complex area.
If someone published a paper about, in a short report about a technique, a surgical technique, but it was a short report, can he publish it in another paper in more details?
Probably not a good idea. Don't think.
Well, unless it was a preliminary and then they provide with larger numbers, but
unless it was an abstract in a meeting or something.
Yeah, if it's substantially the same technique, I think it would be difficult if it's a technique that you report, but you could quite easily see how you could turn it into a different paper if you applied that technique to, a case series, for example.
Follow-up.
Yeah, or did some follow-up or some other aspect of it. But just on its own, the technique with further details is unlikely. Because I guess the question you always, as an editor, you always ask yourself is, well, why didn't they put this into the primary paper? So, and you have this with trials sometimes. You have a trial reported, and then you have a secondary outcome from the same trial, which essentially could have been an additional line in one of the tables of the original trial. And you say, well, why did you need to really publish a whole other paper on the single secondary outcome when it could have just been a single additional line in the original result that was published in another journal, for example? And if the answer is that there's no real good reason, then it will often be rejected. If, on the other hand, it's addressing a particular hypothesis, then I think it could still be of value.
The safest thing is always transparency. In other words, if you write to a journal and you say exactly what the situation is, let them make the decision. If they accept it, it's up to them. If they don't, well, it's too bad. The worst thing you can do is put it into the journal, let it be accepted, and then let them find out. That's always a bad idea.
Yes. It's a very bad idea. Someone will write in and say, we have noticed that, Mr. or Mrs. Bloggs has published this and it was previously published, and you then have a retraction. It's not nice. It's not a nice experience for the author or the editor or anyone else involved.
Yes.
There's a question about how long should authors keep the raw data, you think?
Indefinitely.
Okay.
I've even got data that I collected as a medical student. I've kept it all. You never know when you're going to be challenged, and if you can provide the original data, it's jolly useful. My loft is quite full.
I was going to comment on your library, Phil.
Some
of the data are there.
A lot of it, of course, is electronic.
Yes.
And I've got it backed up several times. I've got all my data backed up on a separate hard disk from my PC, and each one of my two children have another copy. So the data is in 3 houses, just in case one of them burns down. True.
Yeah.
It's so easy to do these days. Why take the chance?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to keep them indefinitely. It's all electronic, and you don't have to keep big files or big boxes with everything.
Oh, we're running out of time.
Yes, just I like to convey the thank you message on the chat, and the willingness of many of our attendees to be a reviewer. So thank you so much. And the final word for Professor Salam, please.
Sorry, can I just say there are lots of people asking about if they can watch the recording from the beginning. Can someone answer this question, please, from Professor Salam or Dr. May? Will this be available, and if so, how?
Well, I think first we need to take the permission of the consultants and professors, the speakers, the distinguished speakers. If they are happy, then I think Professor Salam can arrange for that.
I just wanted to apologize for my wife bringing me in some tea, but just by chance, I've been involved in 3 overlapping webinars for the last 8 hours, and I've hardly moved from it, so I needed some refreshment. So No disrespect intended, but I was getting a bit hoarse.
Oh, cheers, Professor Steer. Well,
can I ask a favor? A big smile from everyone.
All right. Yes, if this is the case.
I've taken a picture. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Where will this go, Aris? LinkedIn?
Twitter.
Twitter. Okay, yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, and this comes to the end of this very exciting webinar. I want to thank again all the officers of the BJOC, Professor Philip Steer, Professor Papagiorgio, Dr. Patrick Chen, Dr. Shiva Fattah, and of course, Dr. Marsh, and also our panelists, Professor Mohammed Momtaz, Professor Rasha, who had to leave us. She has another commitment also. The world is now full of webinars everywhere. And
Yes.
Professor Amr Nouri, my predecessor, and Dr. Wafa Benjamin. Yes, as Dr. Amr Nouri, we record the everything, but before sending it to anybody, we ask the permission, of course, of the panelists whether they would agree on that. And usually they agree, but we still have to do it. And of course, we hope to have the opportunity of running this course face-to-face in Cairo rather than face-to-pubis, as we have been doing for the past 2 years. And yes, Professor Steele, we have now we have about just less than 300 people attending, but the registrations are more than 1,400 from 50 odd countries. I've seen people from Yemen and Morocco they're mentioning it, but what they do is that they watch the recording. This is why we record and then we ask the permission. With this, I thank very much our distinguished speakers who have taken out of the time to share with us their experience and give us enlighten us on how to write a paper in a respected journal and also how to be good reviewers. And with this, I thank you again. And as we say in French, à la prochaine. Well,
thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Professor.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Hope to see you in Egypt soon.
Yeah, in the Greek city of Alexandria, please, not in Cairo. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Yes. So,
thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to Merck, of course.